He'll hear from different students as they summarize 8 different topics that we talked throughout the class, but real quick, a little bit of an introduction. So conservation is defined as being the official supervision of rivers, forests, and other natural resources for their protection and preservation through the use of prudent management. There are a lot of complexities in the field of conservation because you have really complex players and high-stakes outcomes. The goal of the Emerging Issues in Conservation class was to help provide students with an opportunity to learn more about cutting-edge research that's being conducted right now that impacts conservation, and to help prepare the students to be able to contribute something of value once they move into their careers. But before I hand this over to the students, I'd like to say some very important thank yous. To Dr. Aram Calhoun, Dr. Malcolm Hunter, and Dr. Kent Redford for being our fearless leaders throughout the class and ensuring that it was a success in every way. Also, the students would like to say a special thank you to Dr. Bridie McGreevy for hosting a facilitation workshop that taught us not only skills that we learned or could use throughout the week, but also skills that we will be able to take on throughout our careers. Additionally, we had 8 wonderful guest speakers who joined us both in person and remotely, and I'm going to quickly introduce them and their topics. Now keep these topics in mind because in just a few moments a student will be presenting a summary on these. Dr. Kent Redford from Archipelago Consulting talked to us about synthetic biology and potential implications for our research. Dr. Susan Clayton from the College of Worcester discussed conservation psychology and how it impacts more than we may expect. Dr. Michael Scott from the USGS discussed with us conservation-reliant species and implications. Dr. Elizabeth Van Warmer from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln educated us all about zoonoses, the diseases spread between humans and animals and vice versa. Our own Dr. Michael Kinnison from here in the University of Maine shared with us contemporary evolution and broke down some preconceived ideas. Another UMaine faculty, Dr. Bob Stenick, called in from the Darling Center and taught us all about ecosystem resilience and gave some wonderful local examples. Dr. Ariel Lugo with the U.S. Forest Service called in all the way from Puerto Rico to discuss novel ecosystems and some wonderful examples from the island of Puerto Rico. And finally, Dr. Eleanor Sterling with the American Museum of Natural History presented a wonderful discussion of dynamic system approaches to conservation that really summed up the entire week in a wonderful discussion. And now I would like to turn it over to Anish Das to discuss synthetic biology.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm a little nervous, so please bear with me if I fumble along. So I'll be taking up the next 4 minutes or so of your time talking about synthetic biology and its implications on conservation efforts. So what is synthetic biology? Without going too much into the technical definition, it is basically human-induced manipulation on biological systems, from square watermelons, which fit better into your fridge, to gene editing, which saves people from leukemia and other diseases. It is an engineering approach to make natural processes more efficient. Its connection with conservation can be summed up in these 3 points. It can alter ecosystems and species. It can provide synthetic ecosystem services. Synthetic ecosystem services where we synthesize nature so that it has a more efficient output. It has a particularly unethical and malicious vibe to it probably, but we'll address that more in the next few slides. And it also has other potential useful applications. Now, before I move into the presentation further, I'd like to say that I'll try and provide you with an unbiased approach on what synthetic biology is so that you can make an informed decision on your stance with this subject. So the first example that I'll be covering is that of coral reefs, which we all know are an essential component of the marine ecosystem. And they are also on the decline due to warmer waters, which are an effect of climate change. So with synthetic biology, we can genetically manipulate or tweak the genes, so as to say, so that they adapt to warmer temperatures. We could also use 3D printers, as you can see, to make artificial reefs, which could be planted underwater to provide the necessary substrate for marine ecosystem and marine life to thrive. Moving on, the white nose syndrome in bats, which is a fungal infection primarily in bats and have led to a decline in their population over the years. Now, bats contribute an estimated 23 billion US dollars to US farmers, to the farmers in North America through pollination, predation on insects, etc. And the fact that they have only one pup a year, the reproductive rates are very slow, doesn't exactly help their case. So with synthetic biology, we can attack the non-native fungus directly, or we could interfere with its attack on the bats, thus leading to an improvement in biodiversity through conservation of the bat species and also human welfare as a whole, because let's face it, we all need Batman. The next is the example of de-extinction, which is the revival and restoration of extinct species, and is perhaps the most exciting aspect of synthetic biology. Mankind has always had an insatiable need to dwell and be related to its past, and with this technique, well, we can. It would something like this would revolutionize research and create major breakthroughs in science, and it would also create the necessary buzz and excitement that conservation needs very desperately at this time, so that it creates more awareness among the general people. However, there are some concerns which accompany this particular technique of synthetic biology, questions such as whether the reintroduced species would be out in the open, such as in the picture where you can see mammoths and lions roaming around freely, and if so, would their reintroduction have any converse effects? Would it jeopardize the survival of our existing species? Also, would they be able to survive in an ecosystem or an environment which is so drastically different from what they were used to when they actually roamed the earth? Or would they be kept in captivity? And whether that would be the right thing to do. Mankind, we have through our history, we've seen our, we have had a knack to sway away from our focus whenever there is commercialization involved. And whether commercialization of such a technique would move the focus away from conservation, which it actually should be. So to conclude, as exciting as all of this sounds, there are a few concerns which come with it, but then that stands true for everything else in life too. So we as students, researchers, and observers ourselves need to ensure that the right people come together and be part of the decision-making process. By the right people, I mean a collaboration between engineers and conservationists so that we have the expertise and the best of both fields. And also for that to happen, we should be educating ourselves adequately on the subject so that if and when the time comes, we can make an informed decision. Thank you.
So I have a background in biology, and when we first started talking about conservation psychology, it wasn't necessarily the most natural thing for me to assume that this is really important to consider when you're talking about conservation. But I think, and I hope that you'll be the same throughout the next few minutes, is that this is really important in understanding the human aspect and implications when you're talking about conservation. Because conservation psychology is about relationships between humans and the natural environment and recognizing that we're a player within the natural environment. And a wonderful goal of conservation psychology is to help us understand tools and methods that we can use to be more optimistic and more encouraging when we are sharing conservation methods or conservation markets with the rest of society. So, as you can imagine, if you sit and think about it for a few minutes, conservation psychology draws on traditional psychology in understanding human behavior, why people make decisions, why collective groups make decisions. It relates to attitudes. This links back into behavior again in the respect that your attitude about something will impact how you behave or interact with that object or that idea. And a really interesting thing to keep in mind with psychology and conservation is that the health of humans is impacted and can be impacted as negatively as the environment can. So it's as much about understanding how we impact the environment as understanding how that negative outcome may impact us in the future. Understanding the relationships. Again, in the first slide, we heard that this is about relationships between humans and the natural environment. Understanding those relationships on an individual level, on a community level, and on a more global level is all important. And identity. So identity is often considered very strongly associated with a sense of place. And sense of place very much is rooted within the natural environment. Understanding or memory of what species, what plants, what animals used to be in a place where you grew up. When you go back as an adult, it's comforting to see those same species there. If you lose your state bird, that may have a very negative impact on your identity as a community. So, three main things conservation psychology allows us to investigate how humans may cause negative environmental problems. It allows us to explore what the consequences are when we're talking about those human impacts. Not only, as I said, the negative impacts on the environment, but also as it comes back and impacts humans in the long run. And this is maybe my favorite part about the whole thing, is that it's encouraging and optimistic and helping us to be able to develop tools that we can elicit healthy responses when we're trying to encourage communities to participate in conservation. So, in giving an example about sense of place and how conservation psychology can help us when we're talking about conservation in a general sense, is that whether or not you are going on a long hike with your family in the backcountry or you're visiting a zoo in a urban area, you are having a connection and building a relationship with the natural environment. And conservation psychology shows us that that experience, that relationship, is very, very important to fostering a sense of responsibility and connection with the environment as people grow. So a few quick tools that we can draw on for all of our disciplines from conservation psychology is that it gives us the ability to identify behaviors that impact what we're working on or what problems we're trying to solve. It helps us to be able to look long term at what society influences may be down the road and helps us to anticipate some of those and prepare. It helps us to be able to look at creative ways of doing some behavioral modification or tweaking how a community or society may view certain things, and helps us to be more effective when we're trying to educate. Perhaps the most important aspect is it allows us to be able to look at how well we're doing. So conservation psychology can provide us a tool to be able to do an assessment and make sure that what we were hoping to be able to accomplish with our conservation goal is actually being accomplished. A fun example is that some conservation psychology research showed that something as simple as adding a face to an image helps people to be able to connect. Because as a species, humans are engineered to be able to look for faces. It allows us to be able to make a connection with another person. And if you overlay a face into a inanimate object, it actually helps people be able to make that connection more readily, and it will allow you to be more successful in your marketing. So, in summary, the importance of conservation psychology is it helps us to be able to understand the behavior causes and therefore understand behavior solutions to the problems that we're encountering. Environmental problems have significant psychological impacts because people are very closely tied to nature, whether they're aware of it or not. So being cognizant of that helps you to be more successful. Also, the core conservation or core psychological principles are very underlying in the ability to be successful when you're responding to environmental challenges. So having a base understanding of conservation psychology helps you to be able to accomplish your goals. And now I turn it over to Zach.
I'm afraid I'm not as funny as Anish or well-spoken as Elizabeth, but I'm Zach Wood. I'm a PhD student in Mike Kinnison's lab. Mike even came today, which is great. And I'll be talking to you today about conservation-reliant species. So I'd like to start by talking about the typical endangered species recovery plan and how we generally perceive taking endangered species and getting them back from the brink. So the general goal of the Endangered Species Act is to protect the ecosystems on which endangered species depend and in which they function. So typically, if you have a species that's facing extinction, you're going to identify problems, identify what's harming them or their ecosystems. You're going to come in all gung-ho and you're going to get rid of those problems. And then, since you've gotten rid of the problem, the endangered species will come back. So, to summarize that, the primary goal of the ESA is to recover and delist species that are self-sustaining in the wild. And this sounds all fine and dandy, but it can theoretically work for only about 20% of the species on the endangered species list. So what about that 80%? So these species are what we call conservation-reliant species. And as the definition up here says, a conservation-reliant species is a species that needs direct and constant human manipulation, either through manipulating the life cycle of the organism itself or through manipulation of the environment in order for this species to, as the BG said, stay alive. So 3 examples of this: the Kirtland's warbler, which needs constant removal of invasive nest parasites in order to reproduce. Atlantic salmon, which up here in Maine we're pretty familiar with, which need constant hatchery attention in order to survive in the wild. And the California condor, which is making a recovery, but still needs quite a lot of breeding and feeding by humans. And so, as I said, 80% of the species on the endangered species list fall into this category. So, what do we do? Well, I'm going to propose an idea that, if you're listening, might sound counterintuitive, and this idea is delisting, taking these 80% and kicking them off the endangered species list, removing them. Now that sounds crazy, but you don't leave them high and dry. You delist them and then you put into place a conservation management agreement. And what this does is it identifies a local conservation manager. This can be federal, but it could be through a state government, it could be through a town or county government, it could be an NGO, a private company. And you identify this manager, and then you give them biological standards. You say, A, B, and C, this invasive species removal, this breeding, these have to happen for this species to subsist. And most importantly, you figure out where the money's coming from. You get local grants, you get federal grants, you get companies to invest, and you write those funding sources down. So you get everyone involved in this agreement to sign on to a legal document that obligates them to work on this problem. And then you provide for a way for us to check up on these people, to make sure that they're submitting reports and there's management in place to read those reports and make sure that these species are still alive. So this delisting and using a local CMA, Conservation Management Agreement, has some ups and downs. The big ups being that when you delist an endangered species, you have a huge pot of money that's available because, as I said, you can get local governments, NGOs, what have you, and you give localized control to the species. And going back to what Elizabeth said about conservation psychology, by localizing the efforts to bring these species back, you can make it a part of the local identity, you can make it a part of the local culture, you can get people, instead of complaining about paying taxes to save some stupid animal, you can get them to actually feel a sense of belonging to the species and connection to it in order to save it. There are a couple downsides. This can be riskier in the long term because since it has local funding, which tends to be smaller and less stable, it subjects subjects the species to the whims of the economy or local governments, though the whims of the federal government aren't exactly great these days anyway. And the other downside is you have to have a really strong and well-defined legal framework in place in case the local conservation management agreement fails, meaning if your company or your NGO, if they dissolve, if they go away, you need to have it so that feds can pick this species back up again and not just have it stuck in the middle between the CMA and the Federal Endangered Species Act. So to summarize this, the existing ideas that we have about endangered species only can hold for about 20% of the species out there, and maybe the best solution to this is to take that other 80%, take them out of federal control, and give them to local governments and local organizations to let them take matters into their own hands. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Lydia Horn and my partner in crime is Emily Wilkins. We're both master's students in the School of Forest Resources. Today I'm going to be talking about zoonotic diseases and their impact on conservation based on a presentation given by Dr. Liz Van Wormer. So zoonotic diseases are diseases that are transmitted from animals to people and vice versa. 75% of these diseases have wildlife origins, but they can be carried by or transmitted to humans, domestic animals such as pets, livestock, and between wildlife populations and species. A spillover is an event where one population causes an outbreak of a disease in a novel host population. With humans living more closely to animals than ever before, we're expecting to see more of these spillover events in the near future. One of the things that Liz talked about is that we as humans often focus only on zoonotic diseases and their impacts to humans. But there's actually much broader applications, especially in relation to conservation challenges. To address this oftentimes narrow consideration of zoonotic diseases, Liz presented us with the One Health approach, which you can see from this diagram considers not only human health, but also animal and ecosystem health. And it's just a much more holistic and collaborative approach to conservation biology and zoonotic diseases. So to illustrate this One Health model, I'm going to start with an example that Liz provided. Don't worry, I've got some circles in there to help direct you. So the example she provided us related to sea otters in California and Toxoplasma gondii, which you can see represented there in the middle with the Toxoplasma oocyst. So many of you probably know that sea otters are keystone species in many marine environments, and this is true for this example as well. So it turns out in California, the sea otter population was recovering, but not at the rates that they were expecting relative to other populations. And they found that the reason for that was because of this toxoplasma, which was being shed in the terrestrial environment and moving into the marine environment where it was affecting these sea otters. Now, sea otters were especially vulnerable because they live close to shore, and that exposed them to a lot of the runoff coming from the terrestrial environment. So it turns out that Toxoplasma gondii is shed in the feces of domestic, feral, and wild cats. So you can see that over here on the left-hand side of the screen. So the toxin was being released into the environment, and then it persisted for quite a long time in some instances. And then you can see the blue squiggly line there is runoff, and the runoff events were what were transferring the disease from the terrestrial environment into the marine environment. So toxoplasma not only affects marine mammals who have not closely evolved with the disease, but it also impacts groups like humans, especially pregnant women, also some livestock like sheep and goats, as well as a couple other examples that don't really relate here like marsupials. So in addition to inhibiting sea otter recovery, there were also several recent waterborne disease outbreaks in human populations. So you can see from this example, it's not just about humans, it's not just about sea otters, it's about the entire ecosystem and how it was being affected by human land use strategies that were affecting runoff. So this is a really rich example of how multiple players in the same system can be impacted by a zoonotic disease, and how using the holistic One Health approach helped explain the complexity within that system. With this understanding, conservation efforts can now focus on removing or reducing the prevalence of the disease in the environment, thus hopefully boosting sea otter numbers and then bolstering ecosystem health. So in conclusion, understanding zoonotic diseases is important for conservation in multiple respects, which you can see from this diagram. We've got human, animal, and ecosystem health. Although we as humans tend to think first about the response or the impacts diseases have on humans, our gut response might be to cull a carrier population, but that's going to have really negative implications on both the animal's health and the entire health of the ecosystem. So the One Health approach shows the interconnectedness of animal, human, and ecosystem health, and the need to consider all of these aspects to achieve conservation goals. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Alejandro Molina Moctezuma. I'm a PhD student at the Wildlife, Fisheries and Conservation Biology Department. And my collaborator, Connor Wood, he's right now joining us all the way from Vermont. And I will be talking about contemporary evolution. But before talking about that, I want to focus on the second word, evolution. Historically, we've seen evolution as a really long process. Darwin himself described it as a long process, and we sometimes talk of evolutionary time scales when we talk about long time scales. However, evolution can be really fast. So there are several events of rapid evolution, and so a way that I like to define contemporary evolution is as evolution in our lifetime, evolution that we can see. And a prime example of this is fish. If you ask any commercial fisherman or any angler about how fish have changed in the years, they will all tell you fish have been getting smaller. Here I have an example with Northeast Atlantic cod, and we can see how it's been getting smaller, the weight has been reducing, and the age at maturity has also reduced. So this is a change, an evolutionary change that we can see in 70 years, and we can see the changes in 30 years. So why is this happening? Well, there's a new selective pressure caused by fishermen that fish for longer individuals. Therefore, there's a selective advantage to those smaller fish and to fish that mature earlier and therefore can have a reproductive event before dying. Now I will explain the process for rapid change, rapid evolution, which in reality is the same process as the typical long evolutionary change. So there's a change in environmental condition. In my example, it's fishermen, people fishing. But it can be adding dams, it can be a new species that comes to a new place, deforestation, it can be anything. And it's not always human caused. So this change in environmental conditions adds some new selective pressure. And with the new selective pressures, there's the evolutionary process, which has as a result new phenotypes. In the example, the new phenotypes were smaller fish that mature earlier. When doing conservation, it's always important to take this into account. Sometimes we try to take the environment or an ecosystem and move it backwards to a previous state. However, the phenotype of the species living in that area is different from when that environment was in said previous state. Finally, it's important to notice that these new phenotypes also change the environmental conditions. It can be a positive feedback, so it makes the existing change faster and more clear, or it can be a change in different condition. We can think that smaller fish have a different effect in the whole community by predation or whatever. So the new phenotypes also change the environmental conditions. So it's really important to always take into account that evolution affects conservation and that phenotypes change, and the phenotypes we're dealing with right now are different from when the environment was different. And also one way in which we can use evolution to our advantage and as a tool for conservation is using prescriptive evolution. In the figure, you can see that there's a mismatch between the phenotype distribution and the optimum phenotype range. So typically, conservation efforts will change the optimum phenotypic range. This is the environment. Will change the environment so that it will fit the species that they're trying to manage. However, using different tools, and synthetic biology can be one of those, we can change the phenotype distribution towards the optimum phenotype range. So we can do both things. So, and just as a take-home message, evolution should never be discarded when talking about conservation, and we should always think about it before doing a conservation plan. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Samantha Davis. I'm a master's student in the Wildlife Fisheries and Conservation Biology. My undergrad was that. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about ecosystem resilience. So to start off, what is resilience? Resilience is the resistance and recovery of a disturbance. So we have two different types of resiliences. We have ecological and engineering. Engineering resilience is stability around an equilibrium, steady state. A good way to think about this is like a metal spring. As a disturbance comes in, the spring compresses, and when the disturbance leaves, the spring goes back to its original state. Ecological resilience is the amount of disturbance an ecosystem can withstand without changing. Although if the disturbance is great enough, the ecosystem will change and may not go back to its original state. This is considered a flip to an alternative stable state. So to kind of describe how this flip occurs, as conditions or drivers change, so do ecosystem states. In the top graph, you can see an ecosystem with its drivers in the middle, indicated by the arrows. As those conditions change in the middle graph, the ecosystem reaches a threshold, and if those conditions continue to change, the ecosystem can then flip or go into catastrophic fold, as indicated by the bottom graph, and flip into an alternative stable state. So these flips and locks occur. An example would be a lake flipping from a clear to turbid lake. These lakes can then lock into their respective states through the feedbacks created by the flip. So the ecosystem flips and locks into an alternative stable state. In a nutshell, this flip is considered the straw that broke the camel's back. There's a sudden break, and if you remove that straw, the back does not mend itself. So a great example of this is in the Gulf of Maine, where this ecosystem has flipped and locked and it now resides in an alternative stable state through cascading processes. So originally, the Gulf of Maine was kelp forests with large cod as the apex predator. We then decided, as Alejandro gave an example of, overfished the cod and allowed for lobsters, crabs, and sea urchins populations to flourish. The urchins then defoliated the kelp forests, creating these barren sea floors as indicated by the picture. We then found a purpose for harvesting sea urchins. So the harvest was rapid and persistent, allowing for those barren sea floors to be reestablished by microalgae. This microalgae created a perfect environment for crabs. It increased their recruitment potential and decreased the establishment potential for sea urchins. This then correlated with having adult crabs as the new apex predator, where they primarily preyed upon sea urchins. So these two events, the microalgae and the crab, is the positive feedback that allows for the Gulf of Maine to stay in an alternative stable state. So ecosystem resilience is demographically important, and understanding these drivers of the ecosystem can help improve our conservation efforts in the future.
Hello everyone, my name is Gregory Melcher and I'm going to be talking about novel ecosystems. Just to start things off, I'm just going to give a quick definition of what a novel ecosystem is. This is an ecosystem with modified function and or structure resulting from human activity which lacks natural analogs. And they're usually made up of new compositions of species that haven't normally interacted in current day. And there's also different biotic and abiotic interactions. So some examples of human impacts include altered biogeochemical cycles such as phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, water cycles. Our waste cycling has impacted that. The introduction of non-native species. I refrain from using invasives because I think invasives generally has a negative connotation associated with it, and I will focus on non-native species for this presentation. Altered disturbance regimes, such as fire, deforestation could count as a disturbance regime, and altered technosphere, which light pollution is a good example from large cities. So I'll focus on the impact in Puerto Rico. So this is an image of Puerto Rico several decades ago. Dr. Lugo admitted that this is when he was in college. So you can see there's mass deforestation due to we cultivated the land for agriculture, and there are just small patches of forest remaining. In fact, about 90% of all the forest cover in Puerto Rico has been lost, and 11% of the terrain has been covered in pavement. So huge implications on our disruption of natural systems. In contrast, this is an example of an abandoned street that has been reforested. Abandonment is from people migrating or urbanization. And from the untrained eye, you would think that this looks like a native ecosystem. However, it's largely composed of non-natives. And about 17% of the species in Puerto Rico are non-native. So you might wonder what the implications are of non-native dominating and having a substantial part of ecosystems. And I will provide a good example. So generally, non-natives are seen as nuisance, and they usually disrupt native species, and they outcompete natives. But this is an example of a non-native pollinator and an endemic species of plants. And this pollinator, this Africanized bee, actually pollinates this flower most efficiently in this ecosystem and actually can aid in its recovery and regeneration. In fact, novel ecosystems generally function as native, just at different rates, and they have similar structure and physiognomic characteristics. They also aid in carbon sequestration, wildlife support, and the cleaning of water in natural cycles. And as this example showed, they facilitate the regeneration of native species. So just how widespread are novel ecosystems? This is an image of Puerto Rico. And the dark green indicate indigenous forests, and these are areas that are protected. They're parks and such. And as you get darker in color, that indicates the forest novelty, or basically the relative abundance of non-native species. So you can see it's dominated vastly by non-natives. And actually 30% of the biosphere currently is composed of novel ecosystems, so they're extremely widespread, and indigenous systems are diminishing. So you can see that this will have a drastic impact on conservation, both positively and negatively. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Brooke Hafford McDonald. I worked on this presentation with Carl Tugend, and we're both master's students in ecology and environmental sciences. And we're here to talk to you about having a dynamic approach to conservation biology. Let me just start by saying that this approach is a direct result of the changing views of conservation biology. So no longer do we see humans and ecosystems as two totally separate entities, and no longer do we see humans as merely managers of ecosystems, but rather human communities are an integral part of biodiversity, in a term that we call biocultural diversity. So as the name implies, we need both an understanding of biology as well as culture, and know how integrated they are and interconnected they are in terms of our conservation approaches. So in conservation biology, we talk about bringing experts to the table, bringing them together to discuss environmental problems and how we might be able to solve them. So with biocultural diversity in mind, we know that we need to have expertise in cultural knowledge as well as in the biophysical, ecology and biology, for example. Our class was told a story about 6 people and an elephant, where each person in the group is very limited in their knowledge because of where they're standing and what's directly in front of them. And it isn't until they all come together, take a step back and collaborate, that they can truly see the big picture. So incorporating cultural knowledge in this type of collaboration will definitely give us a greater understanding of the issue in front of us. It's not enough to just have the voices at the table. It's about how we as researchers communicate. So on the left here you see the least desirable methods. The first being, of course, no communication happens. Or there's an initial dialogue, but then there's no follow-through. Or how about when researchers come in at the end with a plan in place? Here's what we've decided without your input, and here's what you need to do to comply. We don't think any of those are good options, so rather we would encourage dynamic communication. Communicating early and often, and ideally from a co-identification of the problem to planning, implementation, monitoring, and long-term management. So how important is this knowledge, and is this communication? Let me share with you just a quick story about lemurs in Madagascar. The locals hunted lemurs for food, and at one point it was recognized that the lemurs were becoming threatened. So part of the management plan was to introduce rabbits as an alternate food source. And in the pilot small-scale studies, this went really well. But when the plan was expanded and black rabbits were brought in, the plan ultimately failed. Because it was failed to be recognized that in this particular culture, hunting, or eating rather, black animals was considered taboo. So had the communication happened maybe earlier, more often, or more in depth, valuable resources for this project might have been saved. So in this approach, we're bringing in more voices, we're having more conversations, and this can definitely be more complicated and more time-consuming. I think we need to remember that when you get down to the bottom of it, everybody in the discussion cares about the resource. We just might value it in a little bit of a different way. So it's important for us to make the time. And it's important that we create a space to create understanding. Because we believe that this approach leads to longer-term solutions and therefore more success in everybody's efforts. And that's the final thought I'll leave you with today. Thank you.
Well, we just heard 8 interesting talks on 8 really interesting topics. But it's really important to remember that these 8 topics aren't independent. They're interconnected, and for example, our first topic, synthetic biology, and conservation psychology, can be 2 tools to solve one of the hardest problems in conservation, which is conservation-reliant species. Or those 2 can also be used as a tool to solve problems with zoonosis. Also, synthetic biology, as I explained in the contemporary evolution talk, the knowledge from contemporary evolution can use the synthetic biology tool to solve some of the hardest conservation problems. And as I go along, we can see that both the problems and the tools that can be used are connected. And these are just some examples of connections. There are more. And every single one of these 8 topics that we just talked about is connected. And a really important thing to remember is that in the center of it all lies conservation. So to achieve our conservation goals, we need to use all these tools and to be aware of all the problems. Furthermore, if we go and don't talk about the topics, but talk about disciplines, usually we used to talk about biological conservation. That was the discipline that dealt with biology. with conservation. But now we can see that there are some other disciplines like economics, epidemiology, communication, we just saw psychology, and anthropology that can help us solve the problems in conservation. So really what we need to have is a transdisciplinary approach towards conservation. Again, conservation is in the center of this all, and these aren't the only disciplines that can help us in conservation. There are lots of others, and we need to do an effort to include all of them and to together try to solve one of the hardest problems in conservation. And what's our objective as conservationists? Well, our objective is to manage ecosystem, manage species, maintain ecosystem services, ecosystem functions, and those objectives can't be solved only with biology. And they need different topics, disciplines, tools. Another important thing is that the world is always changing, so we need to change with it. And the natural world is changing, but there's always these disciplines are also always changing. For example, synthetic biology is a discipline that's been here longer than we've used it in conservation. And if we don't, as conservationists, try to use it, other people will. So we need to be a part of it and be part of the group that's taking and making the decisions. Finally, this talk is called Emerging Issues in Conservation, but there are also a lot of emerging potential solutions. We talked about a couple here, so we need to be proactive. And finally, as Elizabeth said, we thank our guest speakers, Dr. Preeti McGreevy, and especially Dr. Malcolm Hunter Aram and Dr. Kent Redford for this course. Thank you. And now our board of experts is eager to answer any questions you might have on any topic.
On any topic?
Well, BA topics.
Why don't you other folks go on up front?
Come up front so we can see you.
So people, you can remind them what you look like when you're talking.
Oh.
I'm just gonna stand here.
Yeah.
So this is a question for Zach and his colleagues about conservation of alliance species. So what are the problems with the Endangered Species Act and related policies that kind of make people think we should go in a different direction?
That's a really good question. We didn't go into a ton of detail on the specifics of the Endangered Species Act. I think the biggest complaint that Dr. Scott talked about in his lecture was just the difficulty of getting federal funding and federal motivation for a lot of this work. So those were the two things we tried to talk about for conservation of alliance species, was funding and motivation.
So on the Conservation of Alliance Species, actually following on from that a little bit, it seems like another important element would be what sort of criteria ultimately does one reach to make that sort of prediction or flip. You're suggesting that in theory there's going to be an 80%. It seems like one of the things that a lot of groups struggle with is as they invest more and more in the species is knowing what that point is. Is there any indication or idea of what one would use to actually kind of make that leap to switching and delisting without a recovery?
Anybody can answer. Or not. You're all free not to answer.
I would like to answer, but I want to
I'm sorry.
say the again.
Oh, so the question just in this case was, how do you make that sort of decision? I think from standing back, kind of big perspective, where you're looking at this from now, you can say, all right, those 80% for a long time have not recovered. They're continuing to be reliant. But I think a lot of programs, when species are getting their actual recovery plans written, at that point in time, people are not thinking, this is one that's going to be reliant forever. They're thinking about moving towards off the list. So at some point, there would need to be a switch. We're not going to recover. How does one make that sort of decision that it's no longer a independent discovery, it is truly human reliant?
If I really understand the question, there is also a solution for that. The difference is it is species specific thing and management, but the one only need is it is one species. They need species specific management. That is the only. If we get it and understanding that one, it's not that much. We will not say this is not work and will not be work on it. So with small management, but knowing that what is specifically is that. For example, the one example gave is all comes with my country. The more I know, really, there is a lot of endemic animals, for example, in Ethiopia. So there's some species like Wale ibex, the one the picture gave, with a little managing the habitat and separating from free grazing from the individual wild animal that is would be sustainable. And like an Ethiopian wolf, you need every time a follow-up to keep not to be with easy. They have been most of the time they hybrid with the local dogs. So knowing that is with easy or with small budgets, you will be series of species. So only we know is what is specifically that species. I guess.
Basically, it's pretty and sort of empirical. It's been there a little while, and it just knew if you took that management away, it would be gone.
Those are two good examples from Ethiopia on either side.
So this was a course that you did on emerging issues. What are you going to do with what you learned? So how did this change how you're thinking about next steps in your education and your career? Oh no.
Well, I can speak for myself. It was wonderful to be able to have things organized in such a way that we could focus on each topic. Because it's if you don't know what the topics are out there that are coming up, it's really hard to search for them. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity where everything's already organized for you, and then you can really focus on delving into each of those. And me personally, I was making notes of, I want to look up this person's work, and I want to go into more details about this kind of thing, because I don't understand as much about conservation psychology or synthetic biology. So making notes as I was going along about which things I had more questions about and was less familiar with, and then basically that, and making notes about I'd like to if I'm ever in Puerto Rico, I'm going to look up Dr. Lugo and see if we could meet for coffee. But
I think for me, I really liked how it brought together the aspect of communicating with the public and bringing that. I don't know, when you think of research or biology in general, wildlife biology, all you do is research, and then relaying that to the public and getting their support was a key factor for me. I really enjoyed that, and I would like to pursue that later in my career.
I think for me, it was kind of the whole week was a little bit of a paradigm shift in how I thought about different conservation type related issues. Not only just broadening that horizon with like synthetic biology, like we started the week with that, and it was kind of just a little bit out there topic for myself, and then once we really looked into it, we could see how it could be applied in many different fields. And then just continuing with that with the different disciplines and how they connected with each other throughout the week, and just brings for me, the importance of whatever work I do to include as many disciplines and many people as possible, and really find out first and continuing through that who are the ones that are affected, like the local people, and what do they want, how do they view the issues, and how do we work to achieve common goals.
Well, I've been volunteering at different non-profit organizations, and typically people think of conservation as protecting the species, one species at a time, and this course actually broadened my eyes a lot. So, well, having to go collect data along the coast in the summer and winter, I think taking some people with me, maybe as volunteers, will really help, so that they get to see, get to experience why we need to conserve certain species and ecosystem. So, and that is related to conservation psychology.
So, I don't remember your exact definition of conservation at the beginning of the presentation, but the idea of conservation in general is trying to preserve something. Usually here we're talking about ecosystem or some part of nature that humans have disturbed. And it seems like a lot of these topics that you were talking about in emerging conservation are in some ways accepting these changes. Like we're talking about accepting how species have adapted to human changes, or accepting genetic modifications or what have you, or accepting that we're going to have to continue to support these species for a long time if we continue to want to have them. For any of you, what do you feel like is the turning point between conservation is maintaining nature exactly as it was at point A, or accepting that there is some amount of change?
Well, I'll try to answer that one. And I think it was Dr. Lugo, I'm not sure who said that you can either try to maintain the ecosystem processes or maintain its structure, but not both. So the natural world has always been changing, even before humans were here. Species evolve, ranges change, climate change, ecosystems change. So change, we need to think that it's a part of nature, and we can't keep things exactly as they are. That's also an unreal objective. And what we need to ask ourselves is what's more important to us, to try to maintain and have the ecosystem processes unchanged, the interconnection between species, even if the species aren't the same as they used to be. We saw the example with the bee and the flower, an introduced species that is actually maintaining that ecosystem process that will be lost without this new species, or if we want to maintain ecosystem structure, the species that are right now. So it's a good question, and it's something that this course also opened my eyes towards. I had the idea of nature shouldn't be changed, and we should do what we can to maintain it as it is, or to bring it back to a previous state. But I think that we need to see that there are other options, and that maintaining just the processes is a possible option that can be done. Any other question? Well, thank you.